Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. Severe weather returns to the southern plains today as we have an enhanced risk from the SPC level 3 out of 5 here for parts of southern Oklahoma into northern and north central Texas, surrounded by a large slight risk that extends up into central Oklahoma, southern and southwest Arkansas, northern Louisiana, down into south central Texas, and a marginal risk level 1 out of 5 surrounding that. Before we go in depth here, let's zoom in, show you who's in and who's out. So this enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, does encompass the entire Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. So if you live anywhere in or near the DFW metroplex today, you are under the greatest threat for severe weather. Threat extends all the way up the I-35 corridor, basically to Pauls Valley, Oklahoma, and areas to the south, places like Marietta, Ardmore, Durant, Hugo, Idabel, Broken Bow, down into parts of northern and northeast Texas. So places like Greenville, Sulphur Springs, Paris, up toward Texarkana, Tyler, Longview, the entire I-30 and I-20 corridors there basically over toward the Louisiana-Texas state line. Shreveport is in that level 2 out of 5 slight risk, as is places like Norman, down toward Lufkin, Nacogdoches, Texas, down the I-35 corridor, Waco, Austin, San Antonio, and out to the west. Marginal risk does include the southeast Texas coast, basically all the way down to Corpus Christi, up toward Beaumont. Houston is in that level 2 out of 5 slight risk area for today. All hazards are on the table. Tornado threat has been increased from recent outlooks. We have now a 10% area. That does include much of the DFW metroplex. Dallas itself, right on the outskirts of that 10%. We'll go ahead and call you that you are in that 10% risk. Places like Plano, Mesquite, Allen are in that 10%, as well as areas off to the east, places like Paris, Sulphur Springs, Greenville, under the gun for that greatest tornado threat today. 5% extends up into southeast Oklahoma, down a little bit farther south of the DFW metroplex, including Shreveport and Lufkin. Damaging wind also going to be a threat today. It does include the DFW metro area and areas to the northeast, and some large, potentially very large hail. It does include places like Norman, down to the south. Those same areas shifted just a little bit west than the wind risk, as the greatest threat for large hail will be in the early portion of the storm life cycle this evening. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start out as we always do with our water vapor satellite imagery. Not a whole lot of high amplitude features you can see. You can see a little swirl, or a pretty big swirl, out here across the northeast coast there. That was our nor'easter that affected states like Vermont and those coastal states up there in the northeast part of the U.S. over the past couple days. That has since moved off. And we really have fairly zonal flow, or east-west flow, across much of the country. And you can see a little bit of this southwesterly flow here across the plains. That is on the east side of a small low-amplitude trough that is making its way into the southern plains today. If we go and look at our 500 millibar map, this is about 18,000 feet in the atmosphere. You can see mostly zonal flow here, but we do have this little perturbation within the flow that is going to be our main player for severe weather today. Now, the timing of this feature is going to be critical today in terms of when we'll see our initiation of severe weather across the region. We should see this move in sometime right around midday to early afternoon. We'll talk about the impacts of that timing here in just a second. I want to go back, though, and look at our visible satellite. We do have quite a bit of cloud cover across the region, but you'll notice lots of clearing out here to the west. If we start to play this loop, you'll see that clearing is moving in nicely from the west. So this cloud cover should not be too much of an issue today. Would expect it to move out. We do have some showers associated with this cloud cover. Here's our current radar. Recording this video at just before 9 a.m. Central Daylight Time. We do have some showers here across the southeast Texas Panhandle into southwest Oklahoma, and some spotty showers here across eastern Oklahoma down into the eastern half of Texas. But nothing really convective at this point. We may see a few rumbles of thunder throughout the morning into the early afternoon hours from these elevated storms as they move off to the northeast. But overall, no severe weather threat is expected until at least midday across the southern plains region. So once again, let's go back to our weather maps here. Once again, very low amplitude trough feature. It's not one of those very deep digging troughs that we often see here in the springtime on the plains. Very low amplitude feature, and that is going to allow for some favorable lift, synoptic scale lift, or large scale lift, and favorable deep layer shear for supercells later this afternoon and evening. Now, we do have this trough moving in, traversing the Rockies, and we know, we've talked about this before, what happens when that's the case. We get a low-level cyclone to develop on the east side of the Rockies. Pretty complex surface pattern at play here. We have a surface low center up in southeast Minnesota. Our main surface low sits down here in southern Kansas. As we talked about, our mid and upper level trough traverse the Rockies, and when that happens, when you have that westerly or southwesterly flow traversing the Rockies, you'll get a surface low to develop on the east or lee side of the Rockies. That's what happened over the past 12 to 16 hours or so. Starting yesterday evening, we had a surface low develop and consolidate here in southeast Colorado that has since moved off a little bit to the east. That's that surface low center you see here in southern Kansas. This is expected to consolidate into one elongated low center today as this southern center moves off toward the northeast a little bit, and we should see a little bit of a secondary surface low develop down here in the northwest Texas vicinity on the trailing edge of the cold front. We'll zoom in here in just a second onto the surface data, but you can see where that cold front is if you look at the wind barbs. Place it right through the pressure tongue here. So the cold front is situated somewhere in here. You can see the wind shift there. It's draped all the way from southern Minnesota down through Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, into the Texas Panhandle. This cold front is going to be a major player for today's event as well, as it has very cold air behind it, very strong winds, and it's going to push this cold front off to the southeast fairly rapidly. As we get this trough to fully eject into the plains, the surface low moves off quickly to the northeast, and that cold front will surge southeastward, and that will define the northern edge of the severe threat. The timing of this cold front is really going to impact the overall threat for severe weather and the timing of that threat and when it will end, especially for with northern extent in the risk area. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Let's go ahead and zoom in to our low-level jet here. Let's go to 850 millibars. When we have this strong low-level mass response, we would definitely expect to see a strong low-level jet in place, and that's exactly what we have. Very elongated 850 millibar trough here, but a very broad swath of low-level jet extending all the way through much of Texas up into the Midwest region. 40, 50, 55 knots of flow here across Texas into Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, and Missouri there. It is out of the southwest. We should have a little bit of veering to deal with in the wind profiles today because this surface low, the main surface low moving off to the northeast, this low-level trough here, if you will, moving off to the northeast as well. So we should see that veering in the low-level jet sustain itself through the day. That's going to somewhat temper the overall degree of curvature in the low-level photographs. Surface winds may also veer a little bit or turn more southwesterly as that cold front approaches, and that is going to overall decrease the low-level shear that's in place. Still will be more than adequate for tornadoes, including as well as some of the other parameters in play, but we should see a decrease from what we see in the photographs right now. Just a sneak peek, we're going to go through the soundings here in a little bit more detail in a second, but you'll notice right now we have very strong-looking photographs for tornadic supercells. This should be tempered a little bit given that southwesterly low-level jet and perhaps some slight veering of those surface winds. If we have these surface winds move off a little bit to be out of the southwest, we'll see a surface point on the photograph like that. Low-level jet, something in this vicinity, so we should see a somewhat of a decrease in low-level shear as we go through the day today. Still should be fairly strong, more than adequate for an all-hazard severe threat, including a tornado threat. But I don't think we're going to see this degree of low-level shear as we go into the evening and the afternoon and evening hours today. Again, we're going to come back to the soundings here in a second. Let's take a look at the surface data. So we're going to focus here on our southern plains sector, and you'll notice the wind shift right away. 35 to 40 knot winds here to the north of the front, out of the north. Southerly winds here to the south, so our frontal zone right in here. And just intuitively, if we have 30 knot winds pushing this front to the south, and we have southerly winds only at 10 to 15 knots or so, what's going to win out? Well, it's going to be these northerly winds on the north side of the front. That's why we're going to see this front surge pretty quickly off to the southeast later on this afternoon into the evening. And again, that's going to temper the overall northern edge of the severe threat and perhaps undercut any storms that form up here along it, as storm motion should be more so to the east or east-northeast. Frontal motion should be toward the southeast. As a result, storms with northern extent especially are going to be undercut, I think, with time as this cold front moves through. Overall, moisture looking pretty good as we As we know, sometimes in these off-season severe weather events, or these early season severe weather events, moisture return can be in question. And we're going to see somewhat just-in-time moisture for today. We don't have 60s dew points, that rich moisture up into the entire region yet, but we do have 60s dew points extending all the way up into northwest Texas at this point. There's our 60-degree isodrosotherm there, or dew point contour, extending all the way up almost to the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex right now. DFW right there sitting at 62 over 58 right now. So we do have that moisture making its way up pretty efficiently given that strong surface low here in southern Kansas, really helping to strengthen these winds in the warm sector, push that moisture northward. So moisture should not be too much of an issue today. We should have a nice warm sector today, especially with southern extent. We should have a nice broad warm sector for these storms to act upon later this afternoon and evening. All right, let's go to some soundings. We'll start off with our Fort Worth sounding from 12Z this morning, so 7 a.m. sounding. And you'll see a couple things right away. Moist layer fairly deep, extends up above 850 millibars. That's that red line, our temperature profile, and our green line, our dew point profile, as the weather balloon goes up in the atmosphere. Very close together there, very saturated there in the low levels, maybe some low cloud cover. As we saw on our satellite image, we should have some low cloud cover in place. That could be some evidence here as well for that low cloud cover in place, that very saturated moist layer. But very deep moist layer, relatively speaking. Some semblance of an elevated mixed layer here, that EML we talked about many times before here. It's that layer of well-mixed, warm, dry air and steep lapse rates that emanates from places like western Mexico, West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and gets transported off to the east atop our moist layer by those mid-level westerly or southwesterly winds. So that elevated mixed layer is in place, going to help cap the atmosphere a little bit. That trough moving in should help erode things, this cap pretty quickly. Probably around midday to early afternoon, we should get storm development, I think, especially as that cold front pushes through into Oklahoma first here as we go through the early afternoon hours. Once again, our photographs looking very, very favorable for severe weather. Deep layer shear is about 35 knots, so somewhat on the margins, 0 to 6 kilometer shear, 50 knots. So deep layer shear fairly favorable for severe weather. That low-level photograph very promising for a tornado threat later on. And as we said, as those surface winds veer just slightly out of the southwest a little bit more, that low-level jet may decrease a little bit in strength. We should see the overall curvature in the low-level photograph decrease somewhat as we go into the afternoon and evening hours. Still will be more than adequate for a severe weather and tornado threat, but I do think that we won't see this degree of low-level shear, which would be favorable for strong tornadoes later on this afternoon and evening. We do already have some elevated instability in place, it looks like, at least some elevated, most unstable instability, 500 joules per kilogram there of Mu Cape, which means that once this cap is eroded, we should see a decent amount of instability start to build as that sunshine moves in from the west. Should see instability somewhere in the 1,500 to 2,500 joules per kilogram range, which is moderate to strong across this area. And as a result, given moderate instability, given at least weak low-level shear to begin with as these storms fire across first central to southern Oklahoma into north-central Texas, we should see a very large hail threat. Steep lapse rates, very moderate to strong instability aloft. Initially, weak low-level shear, as we said, as we described just a few seconds ago, that should favor large hail, perhaps very large hail, hence the SPC's 30% hail risk, hatched hail risk across this area with the initial storm development. A little bit farther to the south, take a look at the source region of this moisture plume, and you'll notice here, very deep moist layer extends all the way down into the warm sector down there into South Texas, so very deep moisture in place, already quite a bit of instability in place down here, and this environment is only going to make its way northward throughout the next several hours, and so this is a fairly decent looking environment for a large hail threat and an overall severe threat as we go into the afternoon and evening hours tonight. All right, let's look at some model data now. This is the brand new North American model run that is coming in as we speak right now. It will start at 500 millibars, once again about 18,000 feet in the atmosphere. You'll see it's initialized our shortwave pretty nicely there, strong belt of flow associated with that little wave. Now the timing of this is going to be critical, as we talked about a few minutes ago. I'm going to zoom in here to our Southern Plains sector so you can see a little bit better. This is at 18Z, 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. You see this little kink in the overall flow. That is going to be our initial little shortwave that may spark convection fairly early in the day. This is at 18Z or 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So given the early arrival of the forcing, oftentimes you like to see that forcing arrive kind of at the peak of diurnal heating or solar heating in the day. So that's why we see often storm events occur, 3, 4, 5, 6 p.m. because the forcing arrives right at the peak of solar heating for the day. That's not going to be the case here. We may see a little bit early arrival of this main forcing, so storms may initiate fairly early, especially across central Oklahoma. As that cold front shifts southward, we should see some help from that, and we should get initial storm development probably right after lunchtime, early afternoon or so across central Oklahoma. And that will again push south and east pretty quickly along the cold front. Now, we will also have our dry line to deal with that will force storms, and I'll show you that in a second. But this forcing may be just slightly mistimed from what is optimal for severe weather, but still not going to matter a whole lot. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, that shortwave into southern Oklahoma, into North Texas, so we should see additional development here out across the I-35 corridor potentially sometime in the mid to late afternoon hours along the dry line. I'm going to show you again the dry line here in a second. Let me zoom back out. We'll look at our 850 millibar map to look at our low-level jet. And you'll see the core of that low-level jet does shift off to the east as that 850 millibar cyclone shifts off toward the northeast. We do still have a very strong plume, though, of low-level jet extending back down into southeast Oklahoma and north central and northeast Texas. So that will be where the strongest low-level shear is going to be. And we've talked about often these prefrontal warm sector storms. There will be enough room, I think, for some prefrontal storms out in the open warm sector. Let's take a look at our surface features, and then I'll show you that warm sector here in a second. So our surface low, you can see that as we talked about, it's going to consolidate our southern Kansas low and our Minnesota low, going to consolidate into one elongated surface low here along the cold front from the Great Lakes vicinity down into southeast Kansas. Secondary surface low tries to develop here in the Red River vicinity of northwest Texas. I'm going to zoom in here again as well. So you see a little bit of a secondary surface low center there, centered right around the Red River vicinity. There's Ardmore, Oklahoma right in there, just to the west of there. And that may be an impetus for some enhancement of storm development right along that corridor here from the I-35 corridor southward toward the DFW metroplex. That's why the greatest severe probabilities are located right along that I-35 corridor just west and east of there. So this is going to be probably our second round of storms. We'll have to watch again those prefrontal warm sector storms and those storms along the cold front. Cold front storms, you can see where the cold front is right here. Those will form first, given some very strong forcing. Quick transition to a more linear mode with those, and they will be undercut fairly quickly, given a southeastward moving cold front and a more east or east-northeast storm motion. So those storms will get undercut pretty quickly. Watching these storms down here along the dry line for the best residence time in the warm sector before that cold front comes through. Let me show you the warm sector here. So this is our moisture. You see 60s dew points up here already into central Texas at the 12Z initialization of this model. Very quick, robust moisture return up into southern Oklahoma. So moisture return not going to be an issue today, but you do see a very stout-looking dry line here. Cold front up in here pushing south rapidly. Forms somewhat of a triple point here right across that northwest Texas, southwest Oklahoma vicinity. But we do have a broad warm sector, so we will have to watch out in the open warm sector. Given the early arrival of the shortwave extending maybe down here into the warm sector, the initiation of storms well ahead of the surface boundaries. Now, most of those storms, I think, will remain elevated. We do have this eastern portion of the warm sector that could be favorable for a surface-based storm or two as that warm sector continues to push north and northeastward into northeast Texas, northwest Louisiana, southwest Arkansas. This afternoon into the evening, we may see a few surface-based storms try to produce perhaps a tornado or two, some large hail, maybe some damaging winds. But again, the main severe threat is going to be tied with these surface boundaries. The cold front, again, initiating storms in around midday. Dry line is where I'm looking for the most robust and long-lived severe threat, all-hazard severe threat. And I think that's what the SPC is looking at, too, given the addition of the 10% tornado threat here east of Dallas, where that warm sector, where that cold front is going to stay away a little bit longer. Right in here, you'll see this is at 4 p.m. That cold front still well off to the northeast. We go to 0Z, 7 p.m. Cold front does come through. We still have a little bit of room out here. DFW not quite at the location of the cold front yet, just to the northwest of there. So those storms, I think, between 21 and 0Z, 4 and 7 p.m. there along the dry line is what we're going to have to watch for any robust tornado and large hail threat. Now, once the cold front moves through, as you see, it does so pretty rapidly. It's going to, number one, cause everything to line out in more of a linearly organized complex. And again, the storms will become undercut. Mostly a large hail threat within these stronger cores, but again, given a more linear mode. Some instances of damaging winds, although storms will become elevated here with time. Maybe a tornado or two if it can drill through the stable layer as they're undercut behind the cold front. So very interesting complex setup. Also can't forget down here about south central Texas. Even though this is a little bit farther removed from the shortwave up in here, may have just enough of a glancing blow for areas like Austin, Waco, down toward even San Antonio, along the dry line there for enough for some isolated storm development this afternoon into evening that could have a large hail and damaging wind threat with those. So let's pull some soundings. Let's take a look at some soundings. This is going to be at 21Z, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We'll take one here just ahead of the cold front, kind of just south of Ardmore. How about right ahead of that triple point? We'll take one out here in the eastern edge of the open warm sector, where we may again have that open warm sector development or prefrontal development. And we'll take one down here along the dry line back to the west toward the Austin area. So this is along the triple point at 4 p.m. 69 over 64 at the surface. We've talked about this before, that the NAM does have some cool bias for surface temperatures. So if we get surface temperatures up into the 70s, this little capping inversion that remains, I don't think is going to be too much of an issue. But we do see we have fairly robust instability, 1,500 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, or storm fuel, if you will. Again, we're going to ignore this capping inversion for now. So we should have moderate instability. Low-level shear has increased on some of these latest runs. Before at 21Z, some of these model runs had very limited low-level shear. We do see an increase in that, an increase in curvature there. The low-level jet may be hanging on a little bit longer, a little bit farther to the west than previous runs were showing. So that's a very interesting development. We may have a large hail threat initially before the threat does turn to a damaging wind and perhaps a tornado threat. Again, especially in areas just farther away from the cold front there into north central Texas. But deep layer shear favorable for supercells, 70 plus knots of effective bulk shear. So that will favor supercells initially. They should be fairly discrete given the westerly flow aloft and the overall orientation of the dry line being more north to south, especially there in south central Oklahoma, north central Texas. Let's look at our shear vectors oriented with the surface boundary. And you can see those shear vectors are oriented pretty much directly off of the initiating boundary, that dry line there. So they're not so much along the cold front, very parallel to the front up here. That's why we're going to see more of a linear mode given the forcing and the orientation of these shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. But farther to the south along the dry line, that sweet spot there in north central Texas, shear vectors are very much off the boundary. Therefore, we should see a discrete mode for a couple of hours before that cold front comes crashing in. But a very favorable look here for supercells. We do have a little bit of backing of the mid-level winds here. You'll see those low-level winds veer for quite a while, but we do have this little kink in the hodograph. I think that's just the slightly early timing of that 700 millibar shortwave, helping to veer the winds here in the mid-levels just a bit. I don't know if that's going to have a huge impact on the overall tornado threat per se. There has been some research that says that this doesn't matter a whole lot. Some that says that if we have very stout backing like this, 90 degrees or so, this is pretty stout backing here, instead of something that would look a little bit more like this, a little bit flatter backing, area of backing in the mid-levels. This may help to temper mesocyclone and tornado strength, but I don't know if that's going to be too much of an issue given a discrete mode there across the region. Usually if you can attain a discrete mode, it doesn't matter a whole lot, but we'll have to keep that in mind, that maybe this backing, given the early arrival of the shortwave, may have a little bit of an impact in tempering the overall long track nature of the tornado threat. So let's go out to the open warm sector. Instability quite a bit less out here, much more skinny instability profiles out in here, much more moist low and mid levels here, but look at this hodograph. Extreme low level shear here. Over 650 meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative helicity. So low-level shear out in the warm sector is extremely, extremely strong. I do think updraft strength will be tempered here because of this very skinny instability profile and a lack of overall instability out here. But any storm that can become surface-based can tap into this very strong shear here, low-level shear, and would have a conditional strong tornado threat, especially those storms. This includes those storms that initiate along the dry line here and move off to the east before the cold front comes in. That's why that 10% area tornado threat is right in here, because it's going to tap into that very western edge of the low-level jet and this area of very strong low-level shear. Deep layer shear, once again, favorable for supercell, so we'll have to watch that closely. Again, I think updraft robustness out in the open warm sector going to be tempered a little bit because of the overall skinny instability profiles, but we'll have to watch that nonetheless. Down to the south, along the dry line, farther south into central and south central Texas. Again, NAM has a little bit of capping down in here. We'll have to watch that. I think that may be just a NAM issue. But strong instability, 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Hood graphs are much more weird, if you will, down in here. Much more prominent kink there in the Hood graphs, so that may temper the overall tornado threat down here. We do have decently strong veering of those low-level winds in the lowest kilometer, so can't rule out an isolated tornado down there as well, but I think the main threat is going to be large hail and damaging winds. Let's go on a little bit to 0Z. So this will be 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Let's take one here just east of the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. That will encompass our area pretty well. And then one here, take one out here in the eastern edge of the warm sector as well. So this is at 0Z. Very unstable environment here. 2,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE. Once again, this is just near the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. Strong low-level shear. That kink still remains. A little bit of backing in the mid-levels. Once again, the effect of that is a little bit unknown at this point. We do have strong low-level shear in a very unstable environment. Would be favorable for a few tornadoes before the cold front comes crashing in. Large hail will be a threat as well for any discrete updrafts that can remain discrete out ahead of the frontal band of convection. And then we'll transition to a damaging wind threat once and some sporadic large hail threat once those storms become undercut and into more of a line this evening. Warm sector, instability just is not there, especially even though surface temperatures may be a little bit low. Instability very, very weak despite very strong low-level shear. So I have a tough time believing, unlike perhaps our event on March 2nd, where we had those isolated storms go out well ahead of the main band near in the Texarkana vicinity near Shreveport on March 2nd. Those were dealing with a lot more robust instability, very strong low-level shear. The instability is, I think, what's going to temper the overall warm sector threat with this particular event. But we'll have to watch, again, that warm sector just in case we do get a few surface-based storms that may be able to tap into this low-level shear to produce a tornado or two. But strong low-level shear, very strong instability near the dry line and just east of the dry line. So any discrete storms will have an all-hazards threat before that cold front comes crashing in. Once the cold front comes crashing in and passes your location, you'll be done with the severe threat. As fast as this front is moving, as strong as the forcing is, we should see a very quick transition to a linear mode as it pushes into north central and east Texas into the evening hours. More of a line of storms with a sporadic large hail and a damaging wind threat there as it moves into northeast Texas, and those storms become somewhat undercut given the speed of that cold front and the motion of the cold front relative to the storm motion. All right, let's look at some high-resolution models. We'll start off with the HRRR model. It looks like we do have some other cams coming in, so time this just right to have some other cams coming in. This is the 12Z HRRR. You'll see sporadic thunderstorm development out here across Oklahoma. This is at noon today. Because of that early timing of the shortwave, we should see storm development occur there in the early, right around lunchtime to early afternoon hours. They become more numerous. And along the cold front, again, how quickly these become undercut, that may be a quick window for these storms, but we will have to watch down here again along the dry line, a little bit farther removed from the cold front for these storms right here. HRRR does have some discrete storms firing down here just near the Red River vicinity down toward the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. These may have the greatest threat for a sustained tornado or two, and as well as some pretty significant hail. You do see a lot of echoes here in the open warm sector. Most of these, I think, are going to be east of the greatest moisture, elevated north of the warm front, you could call it. We do have to watch this back end here, this westernmost extent, or southwesternmost extent, for any storms that can become surface-based in that eastern edge of the warm sector. They will have an all-hazards threat. So some robust storms here, and then we get a pretty solid line as we move into the evening hours as that cold front pushes in. We should be done with severe weather by tomorrow morning as that cold front pushes out into the Gulf and into the southeast states. A couple more cams here. This is the ARW model. So you'll see robust development here along that front and down the dry line as well. So we'll have to watch these again with southern extent. I'm watching these most closely. We do have a couple models now, a couple of these cams now that are showing this down here along the dry line. We'll have to watch these very closely as they will be, again, farther removed from the cold front and have greater residence time, and that could allow for a longer-term tornado threat with those. Large hail as well. So very interesting solution here, very similar to what the HRRR was showing. More of a solid line up there in Oklahoma, perhaps some discrete storms just ahead of the line there in North Texas. Warm sector does try to convect as well, although nothing really super robust. And then we get a solid line with time. NSSL WRF. Let's see another cam here. So pretty early start to the storms, 18Z, right around lunchtime or so. Pretty solid. We do have some semi-discrete elements here, especially on the southern end of this line. Does try to give some robust convection in the warm sector as well. And fairly similar solution to the other models. So what we're seeing is a pretty interesting evolution to this event. Once again, enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5 here for southern Oklahoma into north central and northeast Texas. The initial storm should form along the cold front, central Oklahoma, as that cold front pushes south. So places like Oklahoma City, Norman, first to see storms today along the cold front. That will fire first around midday, early afternoon. Then we'll have to watch the warm sector throughout the entire day. Any storms on the western edge of that warm sector convection, that prefrontal convection that does tap into that warm sector, could have an all hazards threat. But again, the ones I'm watching are going to be the ones down along the dry line, just a little bit farther south into north central Texas, including the DFW metroplex. Most of the models are showing some semblance of semi-discrete to discrete storms down here from far southern Oklahoma into north central Texas, which is supported by the shortwave coming through and the dry line, somewhat of a dry line bulge as well there into north central Texas. Dry line bulges are usually very good for good focus for more robust storm initiation there. So right ahead of that dry line bulge and triple point is where I'm watching for our most robust severe threat. SPC does have the greatest tornado threat there, 10%, including the DFW metroplex in areas north and northeast, Durant, Hugo, Greenville, Sulphur Springs, Paris, under the gun for the greatest tornado threat. Damaging winds, especially as the line becomes more of a solid line and moves through later this evening, and a large hail threat, given the very strong instability with weak-ish low-level shear to begin with there across the Red River region down into north central Texas. So all hazards threat on the table. Once again, the DFW metroplex, the entirety of the metroplex under the gun for severe weather today. So definitely prepare if you are in any of these shaded areas here. So that's going to do it for this forecast discussion. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.